Marcus Webb had served as human military liaison to the Valtheran Empire for 6 months, and he'd learned to maintain careful diplomatic silence during that time. Empress Varath Soltane ruled with absolute authority, earned through 2 centuries of strategic brilliance and ruthless efficiency. And Marcus's role was to facilitate cooperation between human forces and imperial operations, without causing diplomatic incidents through cultural misunderstandings. He was very good at not saying the things he thought. The private audience summons came without warning. Marcus reported to the Empress's personal chambers, not the formal throne room where she conducted official business, but her private quarters where she supposedly retreated from the constant performance of authority. The guards escorted him inside and then withdrew, leaving him alone with the woman whose decisions shaped the destinies of billions. Varath stood at the observation window overlooking the imperial capital, still wearing her full ceremonial armor, elaborate plating that served both protective and symbolic purposes, marking her as warrior ruler rather than purely political leader. She didn't turn when he entered. "Lieutenant Commander Webb, you've been serving as liaison for 6 months now. Your performance reviews are exemplary. Your cooperation with imperial forces has been efficient and professional." Her voice carried the authority that made entire systems obey. "You're also a coward." Marcus's carefully maintained diplomatic composure cracked slightly. "Your Majesty, You maintain perfect diplomatic silence. You never disagree with my decisions, never question my methods, never offer genuine counsel that might contradict imperial policy." She turned to face him, and her eyes held something Marcus couldn't quite identify. Anger possibly, or disappointment. "You're terrified of me. That's reasonable, most beings are. But terror makes you useless as an advisor because you tell me what you think I want to hear rather than what I need to know." "I'm a liaison, not an advisor. My role is facilitating cooperation, not. Your role is whatever I determine it to be. And I determine that 6 months of diplomatic evasion is enough." She moved closer and Marcus forced himself not to step back. "I'm going to ask you a direct question, Lieutenant Commander, and you're going to answer it honestly without calculation or diplomatic padding. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Majesty. What do you actually think about how I govern the Empire?" The question was a trap. It had to be. Answering honestly meant criticizing someone who could have him executed for disrespect. But lying meant confirming her assessment that he was coward who hid behind diplomatic silence. Marcus opened his mouth to deliver carefully neutral response, and Varath made a decision that completely shattered his strategic calculation. She began removing her armor, not suggestively, not as seduction, but with the deliberate precision of someone making statement through action. The ceremonial plating came off piece by piece, shoulder guards, chest plate, arm protection, until she stood in the simple undersuit that served as the armor's foundation. "Do you know what it means in Valtheran culture for a ruler to remove their armor in another's presence?" Her voice was quiet but intense. "It's forbidden outside sacred rites. It's vulnerability chosen deliberately, exposure that says, 'I trust you to see me without my protection.' Or it's challenge that says, 'I dare you to respond honestly when I'm not hiding behind symbols of authority.'" She set the last piece of armor aside and faced him without the ceremonial weight that usually marked her as Empress. She looked, not diminished, exactly, but human in ways her full imperial bearing usually prevented. "So answer my question, Lieutenant Commander, and don't be a coward. Tell me what you actually think about how I govern." Marcus realized that what he said next would define more than their relationship. It would determine whether he was worthy of standing before her as something other than fearful subordinate. Marcus remained silent for a long moment, trying to process what was happening and calculate safe responses. But Varath had demanded honesty, not calculation, and he recognized that diplomatic evasion would confirm exactly the cowardice she'd accused him of. So he chose truth, even knowing it might be the last choice he made. "You terrify me," he admitted. Not because of your armor or your guards or your reputation, because you're brilliant and ruthless and absolutely certain of your authority, and I've spent 6 months watching you make decisions that I find strategically sound but morally complicated. He forced himself to continue. You execute people for corruption without trials I'd consider adequate. You make unilateral decisions affecting billions of lives. You demand absolute loyalty from subordinates who clearly fear you. And I don't know if those things are necessary evils of command or warning signs that I'm serving someone whose methods I can't morally support. Vareth listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. But I also admire you, Marcus continued, the words coming faster now that he'd committed to honesty. You're the most competent leader I've ever encountered. You take responsibility for consequences rather than delegating blame. You maintain order across systems that would dissolve into chaos without your authority. He stopped, then forced himself to finish. And you're the most compelling person I've ever met. I don't know if that's because you're genuinely extraordinary or because power itself is seductive in ways I'm not experienced enough to resist. I've been silent because I was trying to understand before judging, not because I was afraid to speak. The lie at the end, claiming he wasn't afraid, was transparent and they both knew it. But Varath's response wasn't what he expected. You've been silent because you were trying to understand before judging. That's wiser than most beings manage. She moved to sit in a chair that looked designed for comfort rather than ceremony. But silence while you're still deciding whether I'm worth serving is different from silence because you're afraid. I needed to know which kind you were practicing. Why? Because I have thousands of subordinates who obey from fear. I have hundreds who calculate political advantage in serving me. But I have very few who actually think about whether my methods are justified, who try to understand the context before forming judgments. She gestured for him to sit. Your species is new to galactic politics. Your values are different from those of species who have been navigating imperial governance for millennia. That different perspective has potential value, if you're brave enough to actually voice it rather than hiding behind diplomatic silence. Marcus sat carefully. The armor removal, what was that actually testing? Whether you could see me as a person rather than just my authority. Whether you would treat vulnerability as opportunity for exploitation or as trust deserving honest response. Her voice was quieter now. I've been watching you watch me for 6 months. I've seen your careful evaluation, your moral struggle with my methods, your attraction that you've been trying to suppress because mixing professional relationship with personal feelings seems inappropriate. You knew. I'm Empress of an empire spanning 40 systems. I didn't achieve that by being oblivious to people around me. Something like amusement crossed her expression. You're not subtle, Lieutenant Commander. You're just disciplined. But discipline used to hide honest reaction is still hiding, and I needed to know if you could be honest when it mattered. And removing your armor was supposed to make honesty easier. It was supposed to demonstrate that vulnerability requires courage, that I was willing to show you something my position usually prevents, and that I expected reciprocal courage in return. Your honest answer, despite your obvious fear, showed me you understood. She leaned forward slightly. Now we can have actually useful relationship instead of diplomatic performance that serves neither of us. Marcus processed this. What kind of relationship? One where you tell me when you think my decisions are morally complicated, where you provide perspective my own advisors can't because they share my cultural context, where you're honest about both your concerns and your respect. She met his eyes, and where I can occasionally remove the armor of authority and speak with someone who sees me as person rather than just their terrifying empress. That sounds dangerous for both of us. Very, but useful relationships often are. She stood, moving to retrieve her armor and begin the process of reassuming her imperial bearing. You're dismissed, Lieutenant Commander. But from now on, I expect honest counsel rather than diplomatic silence. That's an order." Marcus left her chambers with his worldview significantly recalibrated, and the beginning of understanding that the most dangerous moment of his career might have just become the foundation for something neither of them entirely expected. Their relationship transformed after that confrontation. Marcus continued his role as military liaison, but now with explicit permission, mandate, really, to voice concerns and disagreements rather than maintaining diplomatic silence. The first time he actually used that permission, he nearly regretted it. "Your plan to execute the entire Cronar Administrative Council is strategically sound but morally grotesque," he said during strategy session, reviewing response to corruption scandal. "They're criminals who allowed trafficking networks to operate with their knowledge. But summary execution without proper trials violates every principle of justice my species considers fundamental." The room fell silent. Varath's other advisors looked horrified that someone had just contradicted the Empress so directly, but Varath herself simply studied Marcus with focus. "What would your species do differently?" "Trials, evidence presented publicly. Opportunity for defense. Sentences proportional to actual crimes rather than political necessity." He forced himself to continue despite awareness that he was criticizing imperial justice to the empire's absolute ruler. Executing them all sends message about corruption, yes, but it also sends message that authority doesn't require evidence or process, just power. And you think process matters more than effectiveness. I think process is what separates justice from revenge. Effectiveness without legitimacy is just tyranny that happens to work. Another silence. Then Varath did something unexpected. She modified her order. The Cronar administrators would face trials, expedited ones with imperial judges, but trials nonetheless. Evidence would be documented, and sentences would vary based on actual culpability rather than uniform execution. "Your recommendation adds 3 weeks to the timeline and costs significant deterrent value," she noted. "But it preserves legitimacy in ways that might serve long-term stability better than immediate harsh response. We'll proceed with trials." After the meeting, her senior advisor approached Marcus with barely concealed horror. "You just told the Empress her justice was grotesque. You're fortunate she didn't have you executed for disrespect." "She ordered me to provide honest counsel. That's what honest counsel looks like." But Marcus's hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline. Over the following months, he learned that Varath valued his different perspective specifically because it wasn't filtered through fear or cultural assumptions about imperial authority. She explained context behind decisions he'd found morally complicated, and he began understanding that some things that looked like casual cruelty were actually carefully calculated responses to political realities he hadn't fully grasped. Her executions weren't arbitrary. They were messages to networks that corruption must be eliminated decisively. Her unilateral decisions weren't dismissiveness. They were acceptance that ultimate responsibility requires single decision-maker when situations demand immediate response. Her subordinates' fear wasn't terror of irrational violence. It was awareness of extremely high standards, but also that she protected those who performed competently. Marcus's initial assessment had been incomplete. Her methods were more ruthless than human governance typically allowed, but they weren't cruel for cruelty's sake. They were strategic approaches to maintaining order across an empire where authority's failure created chaos, costing more lives than her harsh methods did. He didn't agree with everything she did, but he understood the framework, making her choices logical within her responsibilities. He also became one of very few people Varath trusted enough to show vulnerability to. The exhaustion of command, the weight of decisions determining whether civilizations thrived or failed, the loneliness of authority preventing genuine connection, because everyone was either afraid or calculating advantage. You told me during the armor incident that you didn't know if you could morally support my methods, she said during private conversation months later. Have you decided? I support your goals. I question some of your methods. But I understand why you make the choices you do, even when I wish there were less harsh alternatives. Marcus met her eyes. That's probably the most honest answer I can give. I'm not comfortable with everything you do, but I respect that you're trying to maintain order rather than just accumulating power for its own sake. That's more than most beings who serve me manage. They either accept my authority without question or reject it as tyranny without understanding context. She smiled slightly. You offer third option, careful evaluation that takes my responsibilities seriously while maintaining your own moral framework. That's why your counsel is valuable. Their relationship remained professional, but it had become genuine, built on trust created when he'd spoken truth at the most dangerous moment, and she'd responded by treating that honesty as valuable rather than threatening. The real test came when Varath's decision to eliminate an entire planetary administration for systemic corruption conflicted with human diplomatic protocols. The executions were legal under imperial law and strategically necessary, but they violated treaties about human involvement in capital punishment. Marcus was caught between representing human values and understanding that Varath's harsh response was actually the least violent option. Allowing corruption to continue would eventually require military intervention costing more lives. He requested private audience and delivered honest assessment. Your decision is strategically optimal but politically impossible for me to support publicly. I can't defend mass executions to my government regardless of strategic necessity. You'll need to proceed without human endorsement, which will strain the alliance, but is better than me pretending to approve actions that contradict my species' fundamental values. Varath's response demonstrated how much their relationship had evolved. Your honesty about limitations prevents worse diplomatic breach later. I'll proceed but structure the response to minimize human diplomatic exposure. And I'll provide documentation of the corruption and my reasoning to help you explain to your government why you didn't actively oppose me despite disagreement. She was treating him as trusted advisor, whose different perspective had value rather than subordinate who must simply obey. The incident reinforced their unusual dynamic. Marcus served her strategic interests, but maintained independence to disagree when her methods exceeded what he could morally accept. She valued that independence because it meant his support, when he did provide it, was genuine. Years later, when Marcus briefed new human liaisons on working with imperial authority, he explained the armor incident with appropriate discretion. She demanded honesty at the most dangerous possible moment. That honesty, acknowledging both my concerns and my respect, created foundation for relationship built on actual trust rather than fear-based compliance. The most important lesson is that powerful people need honest advisors more than fearful subordinates. But you can only be honest advisor if you're brave enough to speak truth even when it's uncomfortable and might cost you everything. The alien Empress who'd removed her armor to test a human's courage taught him that real strength includes chosen vulnerability, that authority includes listening to disagreement, and that the most valuable partnerships are built on honest recognition of both shared goals and fundamental differences. And Marcus, who'd spoken truth when silence would have been safer, learned that sometimes the bravest thing is being honest with someone who has power to destroy you. Because that honesty, if received well, creates trust that fear-based relationships can never achieve. The armor incident became legend in human imperial relations. The moment when an empress demanded honesty and a human was brave enough, or foolish enough, to provide it. And that moment of vulnerability and truth created partnership that shaped diplomatic cooperation for generations. Because sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to be a coward when someone powerful enough to destroy you asks you to speak your mind. And sometimes, If you're very fortunate, they'll respect that honesty enough to build something real from